The winter of 1945 came to Fayetteville, West Virginia, with the kind of cold that settles into your bones and doesn't leave until spring. The town itself was nothing remarkable. A main street that ran less than 100 meters, populated by roughly 1,300 souls, many of them Italian immigrants who had come seeking the promise of America in the coal country of Appalachia. Among these families, the Sodders stood out, not for wealth or prominence, but for something quieter, respectability. George Sodder had built a life here, a trucking business that hauled dirt and coal and freight through the mountain roads, a 2-story timber frame house painted white, standing 2 miles north of town, and a family of 10 children, ranging from a 23-year-old son to a toddler barely 2 years old. By all accounts, they had achieved what we now call the American dream. But dreams, as we know, can end in an instant. To understand what happened on Christmas Eve 1945, we must first understand George Sodder himself. He was born Giorgio Sodu in 1895 in the town of Tula on the island of Sardinia, one of the poorest regions of Italy at the turn of the century. In 1908, at the age of 13, Giorgio left his homeland, accompanied by an older brother, bound for Ellis Island and the promise of a new life. The records show they cleared customs together, but the older brother immediately turned around and returned to Italy, leaving 13-year-old Giorgio alone in a country where he did not speak the language. Why the boy left Sardinia, he would never fully explain, not to his wife, not to his children, not even in his final years. He spoke little of his youth in Italy, but those who knew him understood that George Sodder, as he came to be known, harbored a deep opposition to Italian fascism and to Benito Mussolini in particular. This was not unusual among Italian immigrants who had fled poverty and oppression, but George was more vocal than most, and in the tight-knit Italian community of Fayetteville, this would matter. The boy found work on the Pennsylvania railroads, carrying water and supplies to the laborers who laid track through the mountains. It was brutal work, the kind that ages a child into a man quickly. In 1912, when George was 22, he registered for the Selective Service ahead of World War I, listing Michigan as his home and working as a plumber's helper in Detroit. The draft record shows he sent money back to his family in Italy, even then, trying to lift them from the poverty he had escaped. By the 1920s, George had moved to Smithers, West Virginia, where he took work as a driver before launching his own trucking company. He was smart, ambitious, the kind of man who saw opportunity where others saw only hardship. It was in West Virginia that he met Jenny Cipriani, the daughter of a local shop owner, herself an Italian immigrant who had come to America as a small child. They married, and between 1923 and 1943, they had 10 children. John, born 1922, Marion, born 1926, George Jr., born 1929, Maurice, born 1931, Martha, born 1933, Louis, born 1935, Jenny, born 1937, Betty, born 1940, Sylvia, born 1942, and Joe, the second oldest son, born in 1924. By December 1945, the Sodders were considered one of the most respected middle-class families in Fayetteville. George's trucking business had prospered during the war years, hauling coal and supplies through the mountain roads, and the family had everything they needed. The 2-story house was modest but comfortable, with the children's bedrooms in the attic space on the second floor. George was known in town as a man of strong opinions, never shy about expressing his views on business or politics. His opposition to Mussolini was well known, and though the dictator had been executed by Italian partisans in April 1945, some members of the Italian immigrant community still harbored resentment toward George for his outspoken criticism. But these were old grievances, or so it seemed. The war in Europe had ended in May. The war in the Pacific had ended in August. Joe Sodder, the second oldest son, had enlisted in the military and was expected home soon. Christmas 1945 would be the first holiday season in years when the family could celebrate in peace, without the shadow of global conflict hanging over them. Or so they thought. In October 1945, 2 months before the fire, a life insurance salesman came to the Sodder house. He wanted to sell George a policy. George declined. What happened next would be recounted by the family for decades, though the exact words varied slightly in the retelling. The salesman grew angry, his face flushing red. According to George's account, the man said, "Your goddamn house is going up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed." When George asked what he meant, the salesman replied, "You are going to be paid for the dirty remarks you have been making about Mussolini." George dismissed the threat. He had heard angry words before, and threats were cheap, but the encounter stayed with him. Around the same time, another stranger appeared at the Sodder property, ostensibly looking for hauling work. George spoke with him briefly, but the man wandered to the back of the house without permission. When George found him, the stranger was standing near 2 fuse boxes, staring at them. "This is going to cause a fire someday," the man said. George found this comment peculiar, because he had just had the house rewired when an electric stove was installed, and the local power company had inspected the work and declared it safe. The man left, and George thought little more about it. In the weeks before Christmas, some of the older Sodder children noticed something else. A car, unfamiliar, parked along U.S. Highway 21 near their property. It appeared repeatedly, always around the time the younger children walked home from school. The occupants of the car watched the children, made no attempt to hide their interest. Maurice, 14 years old, mentioned it to his father. George told him to be careful, but what could he do? It was a public road. People had the right to park where they liked. Still, the pattern was unusual enough to be remembered. December 24th, 1945, was cold but clear. The Sodder house smelled of cooking and wood smoke, the kinds of smells that make a house feel like a home. Marion, 19 years old and the oldest daughter, had been working at the Walls dime store in downtown Fayetteville. She had saved her money, and on Christmas Eve, she surprised her younger sisters with gifts: new toys for Martha, 12 years old, for Jenny, 8, and for Betty, 5. The younger children were overjoyed, and they begged their mother to let them stay up past their bedtime to play with the new toys. Jenny agreed, with one condition: that Maurice and Louis remember to do their evening chores, putting the cows in and feeding the chickens, before they went to bed. The boys agreed. George and the 2 oldest boys, John, 23, and George Jr., 16, had spent the day working at the trucking business. They were exhausted, and they went to bed early. Marion stayed up for a while, watching her younger siblings play, before falling asleep on the sofa downstairs. Jenny took 2-year-old Sylvia upstairs with her, and by 10 o'clock, the house was settling into sleep. Joe, the second oldest son, was not home. He had been discharged from the Army just the day before, but was held up at a base in North Carolina. He would miss Christmas, but the family hoped he would be home soon. At 12:30 in the morning, the telephone rang. Jenny woke, disoriented, and went downstairs to answer it. The voice on the other end was a woman, unfamiliar. She asked for someone whose name Jenny did not recognize, someone who did not live in the house. Jenny told her she had the wrong number. Before hanging up, Jenny could hear other voices in the background, the clink of glasses, and what she would later describe as weird laughter. She hung up, puzzled, and went back to check on the children. Marion was asleep on the sofa. The younger children were in bed. The house was quiet. Jenny noticed that the Christmas lights were still on in the living room, twinkling softly in the darkness. She returned to bed. At approximately 1 o'clock in the morning, Jenny woke again. This time, it was to a sound on the roof, a loud thump, followed by something rolling. She lay still, listening, but heard nothing more. After a few minutes, she drifted back to sleep. 30 minutes later, Jenny woke for the third time. This time, she smelled smoke. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding, and saw that the bedroom was filling with gray haze. She ran to the door, opened it, and saw that George's office, adjacent to their bedroom, was engulfed in flames. The fire had already spread, blocking her access to the telephone. She screamed for George, shook him awake. He bolted from bed, and together they began to wake the children. George Jr. and John, sleeping in a room on the first floor, heard their father's shouts and stumbled out of bed. John would later say he ran upstairs to wake his younger siblings, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, the 5 children who slept in the attic bedrooms. But years later, he would change his account, admitting that he had only shouted at them from the base of the stairs. He could not say whether they had heard him. By now, the fire had consumed the staircase, the wooden steps collapsing into flame. George tried to reach the second floor, but the heat drove him back. The smoke was thick, black, suffocating. Marion grabbed Sylvia and ran outside. George, Jenny, John, and George Jr. followed. They stood in the yard, the December cold biting through their night clothes, and stared up at the house. The windows on the second floor were dark. No one appeared at them. No one called out. George ran to the side of the house, where he kept a ladder propped against the exterior wall. The ladder was gone. He searched frantically, but it was nowhere to be found. Next, he tried to start one of his coal trucks, thinking he could drive it close to the house and climb onto the roof from the truck bed. The engine would not turn over. He tried the second truck. It would not start either. Both trucks had been running perfectly the day before. George ran back to the house, broke a window with his bare hand, cutting a deep gash in his arm. He tried to climb through, but the flames drove him back. There was nothing he could do. The 6 Sodders who had escaped stood in the yard, helpless, as the house burned. Marion ran to a neighbor's house to call the Fayetteville Fire Department. She could not get an operator to answer. Another neighbor, seeing the flames from a distance, drove to a nearby tavern and tried to call from there. Again, no operator answered. Finally, the neighbor drove into town, a distance of about 2 miles, and tracked down Fire Chief F.J. Morris. Morris was notified shortly after 1 in the morning that children were trapped in a burning house, but the fire department did not arrive until 8 o'clock. The delay was later explained, or attempted to be explained, by a series of unfortunate circumstances. The Fayetteville Fire Department was undermanned due to the war, relying on volunteer firefighters who had to be contacted by telephone. The department did not have a central alarm system. Instead, it used what was called a phone tree, one firefighter calling another, who called another, until all available personnel were notified. This process took time. Chief Morris would later admit that the response was further delayed by his inability to drive the fire truck. He had to wait for someone who could operate the vehicle to arrive. By the time the fire department reached the Sodder property at 8 o'clock in the morning, the house had been reduced to ash. The structure had collapsed, the timbers blackened and twisted, the foundation filled with rubble. George Sodder stood at the site, his arm bandaged, his face hollow with shock. Chief Morris and his men began to sift through the debris, looking for remains. By 10 o'clock, Morris told the Sodders that they had found no bones, no teeth, no trace of the 5 missing children. George asked how this was possible. Morris suggested that the fire had been hot enough to completely cremate the children's bodies, reducing them to ash that had blown away or disintegrated beyond recognition. George was not convinced. He had seen crematoriums during his travels, had heard from others that even intense fires leave bones behind. But Morris insisted. The fire had been unusually hot, the structure had burned quickly, and the children's remains had been consumed. The local coroner convened an inquest the next day, December 26, 1945. The jury concluded that the fire was an accident caused by faulty wiring. The 5 missing children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, were declared dead. Death certificates were issued on December 30th, 1945, listing the cause as fire or suffocation. Among the jurors who ruled the fire, an accident was the life insurance salesman who had threatened George 2 months earlier, the man who had said the house would burn and the children would be destroyed. George noticed this. He said nothing at the time, but he would never forget. In the days after the fire, the Sodders began to notice inconsistencies. George had the wiring inspected just weeks before. The local power company had declared it safe. If the fire had been caused by an electrical problem, why had the Christmas lights remained on throughout the early stages of the blaze? Why had the power not gone out? The missing ladder was found 4 days later, hidden in an embankment 75 feet from the house. Someone had moved it. Someone had deliberately placed it where George could not find it. The telephone line, initially thought to have burned, was examined more closely. It had been cut, not burned. Cut. George's trucks, both of which had been running perfectly on December 24th, were examined by a mechanic. The mechanic found that the fuel lines had been tampered with, deliberately clogged to prevent the engines from starting. And then there were the sightings. A woman who lived along the road between Fayetteville and Charleston claimed she saw the 5 Sodder children in a car on the morning of December 25th. They were with 2 men of Italian descent, she said. The children were alive, watching the fire from a distance. A hotel operator in Charleston, 50 miles away, reported that she had served breakfast to 4 of the Sodder children on the morning after the fire. They were accompanied by 2 men and 2 women, all of whom appeared to be of Italian extraction. When she tried to speak to the children, one of the men glared at her and began speaking rapidly in Italian. The whole party went silent. The children said nothing. A bus driver reported seeing people throwing balls of fire at the Sodder house on Christmas Eve. Months later, when the snow melted, Sylvia, the youngest survivor, found a small, hard, dark green rubber object in the brush near where the house had stood. George examined it, later describing it as resembling a pineapple grenade or some other incendiary device. 4 days after the fire, George and Jenny could not bear to look at the ruins any longer. George brought in his bulldozer and covered the site with 5 feet of dirt. He would not rebuild. Instead, he would create a memorial garden for his lost children. Jenny tended the garden for the rest of her life, planting flowers each spring, pulling weeds, keeping the site clean. But as the weeks passed, George and Jenny began to doubt the official story. They did not believe their children had died in the fire. They believed something else had happened, something deliberate, something terrible. And they would spend the rest of their lives trying to prove it.